This is great. This is more people than I expected. Thanks everybody for coming out. The great transformation. That is a huge topic. There's no way that I can cover the extent of the great transformation in the next 30 minutes. But the great transformation is a move away from fire, a move away from burning stuff. For eons, human progress has been measured by how well we can burn wood, oil, gas, initially for heat, for cooking, for steam, and eventually electricity. Sure, we had other energy sources. We had small-scale hydro, we had small-scale wind to power simple machines, but everything relied on fire for advancement. We have decided collectively, well, at least I hope that we've decided, COP28 is yet to be determined, that we can't burn stuff for progress anymore. And progress was really, how do you burn things better? Now it's how do you generate energy more efficiently? The great transformation is moving away from burning for advancement to other forms of energy. And this is the biggest shift in humanity, I think, that we've ever seen. There's the industrialization when the steam turbine was invented, but today we're moving away from that. And this is going to create more wealth, more prosperity, more equity, assuming that we do it right. And that's a big assumption, but assuming that we do it right of anything that's been undertaken by humanity. Skip already said the thanks, so I'll move on from that, but thank you very much for you all showing up. Thanks for having me here. And please, let's have this be a discussion rather than me standing up here and going through all of my notes, because I have a lot of notes, and raised hands are much more interesting than somebody at the front of the room just talking. But why Mike? Why am I up here? And Skip, it's Mike Wietecki. It's how you open a door. It's Wietecki. So now you all know it. You've got the trick. Feel free to use it and hand it on. But my background, so I was in investing for about a decade. I focused on clean tech and renewables, special situations and operations. In 2016, I was introduced to Jeff Brown, the then CEO of Powin Energy, at a chance meeting, and he asked me if I wanted to build something instead of just invest in stuff. And I jumped at the chance. I had no idea how much work it took to actually build rather than invest. So those in the investment community, no offense to you, but it's the people on the other side have a much harder job. Powin was founded in the 80s as a global contract manufacturer. They had plants in China, in the US, in Mexico, and they primarily focused on the recreational consumer goods equipment business. And in 2012, they decided to start a pivot towards renewables. So you have this global supply chain corporation that is now moving to renewables, and they focused on utility scale battery energy storage and building a better battery. They skunk worked, I don't know if that's really a word, skunk worked, but they had a skunk works developed to commercialize a utility scale battery energy storage technology for about 4 years before I joined. And in 2016, we secured our first contract. In 2016, we ended the year with $0 in revenue and less than a dozen employees. At the end of 2022, we had signed the largest single project on the planet, a nearly 2 gigawatt-hour battery. This year, today, we've got about 500 global employees and billions of dollars of backlog. So it's been a bit of a ramp since 2016 to today, and we think we're still in the first 2 innings of growth, not just for Powin, but for the industry. How did we do it? Well, timing was great. The cost of cells, the cost of the raw material of battery energy storage had reached a point where the applications multiplied. And then there was a tremendous amount of sacrifice and hard work of the team and just bringing on really smart and hardworking individuals. I don't know if do we have slides up here? There we go. All right, so some quick numbers about what the great transformation is going to entail. In the next 20 plus years, between now and 2050, while we're moving to zero carbon economy, the demand for electricity is going to triple. That's a really important fact. We've got to go from virtually 100% of our energy being generated by carbon-intensive forms to no carbon while we're tripling the amount of energy we actually consume. 85%, and these are numbers from the UN, 85% of all electrical generation needs to come from renewables, and that remaining 15% will have to have carbon capture attached to it. There's not a chance to do otherwise. The cost of this transformation is mind-boggling. McKinsey estimates that in the few years leading up to 2050, we'll be spending across the net zero economy about $9 trillion per year just in transformation. That's new investments in new technology and deploying those technologies across the global market. That's a lot. But the good thing about that is that 70 countries with net zero carbon goals is now 140 countries with net zero carbon goals. 90% of the global GDP has signed on to net zero commitments between now and 2050. So there's people that are moving in the right direction. And there's a lot of momentum. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and if anybody has questions about that, that's an entire topic on its own. Raise your hand, let's talk about it. It's great. It's going to create tons of jobs, job security for the next 10 years for anybody in renewables. But the Inflation Reduction Act was passed about 18 months ago. And by all estimates, it's going to invest about 800 billion to 1.2 trillion in the US economy, focused squarely on renewables. Battery energy storage is going to be a recipient of a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that. There's massive investment globally trying to match that. We're in a competitive country-by-country marketplace, and so other economies, other governments are trying to match that type of investment. Nobody can, because the IRA is the biggest single investment that's ever been made into renewables. The world is moving really fast. We've seen massive adoption of things as simple as LEDs, EVs, wind, solar is growing at an incredible rate, and fossil fuel plants are retiring. We are seeing fossil plants being turned off and decommissioned. But there's also bad news. I don't know if anybody follows COP28. Does anybody follow any of the news from COP28? They couldn't agree that we actually needed to phase down or phase out fossil fuels in order to reach zero carbon by 2050, in order to stay in accord with the 1.5 Paris Climate Agreement. That's nuts. And what's also a sort of a flip side, a good part of that, is some countries got together and said, no, and US is one of them, we're going to continue and we're going to keep everybody here, and we're not going to agree to leave COP28 until language phasing out or phasing down fossils is adopted in the COP28 documents. So kudos to the countries for forcing that. But we also continue to refuse to seriously use the single biggest tool to reduce carbon emissions, which is carbon tax, putting a price on carbon. It's almost sacrilegious to bring that up, but that is the best tool that we've got. And the current state from a market and a battery market perspective, oh, this is a bit about Powin. So we're one of the top best integrators. We're top 5 globally based on S&P Global's estimates. We have about 3.2 gigawatt hours deployed, nearly 12 gigawatt hours under construction. We have 10 global offices and 500 employees throughout the world. One of the things that's happening right now in the market that's really interesting, especially for our business, is we're seeing max penetration of renewables. That means that solar and wind in certain marketplaces are reaching a point where in order for the market to continue to operate, the grid to continue to operate, we have to curtail that generation. You have to shut it off. And so there's price signals that are going to generators saying, hey, you can't put more renewables on the grid here. It's saturated. Or if you want to keep generating, you have to pay. There's negative pricing. That opens up tremendous opportunity when there's negative pricing or zero pricing on generation. And one of those opportunities, or let's look at the opportunities for generators. A generator can either pay to continue generating, which is nonsense. They can curtail, so they can stop generating, which makes literally 0 sense. Or they can figure out how to move that power throughout the grid by adding transmission. That's extraordinarily expensive and time intensive. or we can build batteries. We can build storage. And when I'm talking about batteries from the global scale, it's not just lithium-ion based batteries, which is the flavor of batteries that Powin builds. It's any sort of battery. It's any sort of energy storage. Pumped hydro, pump water up a hill, bring concrete blocks, raise them up and pile them up, and then lower them. Someone's shaking their head. Yeah, shake your head. That's a crazy idea, right? But it should get some investment because theoretically it could work. And right now there's no real crazy ideas. Lithium ion was absolute bonkers idea 10 years ago. And now we're building billion-dollar projects that work. And that work is a big, important point. And so rather than stopping generation, you build batteries. You can't build transmission fast enough. And those batteries are being put in markets where they have an opportunity to arbitrage pricing, to change demand curves, and to basically time shift when generation is needed to meet demand. Then the question is, what kind of batteries are we going to build? Well, today it's lithium ion. Tomorrow it might be something else. There's all kinds of technologies out there. But today it's lithium ion and a particular chemistry of lithium ion, lithium iron phosphate, that's dominating. About 90% of all global storage is lithium ion based. And that's for some pretty simple reasons. The first is history. Everybody, where's my cell phone? Everybody has a cell phone in their pocket. That's lithium ion. If you drive an electric car, there's a lithium ion battery in it. If you had a camcorder 20 years ago and you're rich enough to have a really nice battery, it was a lithium ion battery. So for decades, we've been investing in the lithium ion technology, and we've built global supply chains that allow for scalability. Supply chains is the second real reason. We have the ability to move massive quantities of lithium ion throughout the world. Abundance. Everybody hears about the scarcity of these materials that are in lithium ion cells, the cobalt, the manganese, nickel, titanium. Lithium iron phosphate is the chemistry, the particular flavor of chemistry we use doesn't have any of those. Lithium is fairly abundant. Iron, pretty darn abundant. Phosphate, it's all over the place. So these are abundant materials. Sure, we don't quite have the mining and the extraction industry built up in order to efficiently extract those materials, and that's the dark side of everything. There's always extraction involved. We can talk about that also. And lithium iron phosphate batteries are deployable. You can put these things virtually everywhere. You can't pump water up a hill virtually everywhere. You need a hill. You need actual geography in order to build pumped hydro. Batteries, you can put them anywhere. The alternatives to lithium ion, there's a lot of them. Green molecules, hydrogen. We all hear about hydrogen. It's a massive opportunity. It's not there yet. It's way too expensive. Its costs are going to come down, but today it's not a viable alternative. Flow batteries, great technology, super exciting. There's some issues with it, but we do expect that that's going to become a highly competitive storage technology in the coming years. Ammonia, gravity, there's all kinds of alternatives, but lithium ion is going to be the technology for the foreseeable future. But all of these alternatives need focus and need investment. And that's where the IRA really comes in. It subsidizes investment in these technologies to see if they can be feasible. Any questions yet? Come on, we just covered, no, nothing.
GDP Europe. How does that translate into population? So you have a few wealthy countries that support it, and the population growth comes from countries that are not part of that GDP, having part of the agreement. That's where a lot of the assumptions made. How do you make it cheap enough or replaceable so that it makes sense to?
That's a good question. Who can Google what of the population is covered by that 90% while I'm answering the second part? How do you make it cheap enough? Because I don't know off the top of my head. Great question. And when somebody has the answer, just shout it out. All right, so the second part, how do you make it cheap enough? The market is making it cheap enough. We're seeing that happen. We've seen costs come down just in the last 3 years by 80%. So when you expand when you decrease the cost, you expand the opportunities where lithium ion based energy storage becomes economic. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but the cost will naturally take care of itself. Lithium batteries plus solar is cheaper than coal-based generation. And coal-based generation for the last decades has been the cheapest source of power. And so there is not a cost issue. It's a willingness to move fast issue today. Anybody have an answer to that population question? You have supercomputers in your pockets. Come on, guys. All right. And so for the foreseeable future, yeah.
Do populous countries plan to get a growth rate of that factor?
In the EU member states, all have net zero commitments. So, I mean, it's probably something like 90%. Yeah, this corner's owning it. You guys slack. Yeah. So the question was about vehicle to grid, V to G, V to X, all those cool V to whatevers. And how do the mobile batteries in a vehicle translate into energy storage as a resource on the grid? And it's a great question. It's a huge question. There's actually a great podcast, Shiel Khan Catalyst Media, that did an hour on this topic, but I'll summarize it in a couple minutes or maybe a couple seconds. We'll see how I can do. V to G or V to X makes a ton of sense even at the small scale. And I do think that batteries, as the cost continues to come down, are going to be deployed everywhere. And we can talk about this in a minute. And when I say everywhere, literally every substation in the US or on the planet should have a battery on it in the next 10 years. Anywhere there's grid congestion, anywhere there's upgrades needed, anywhere where there's transmission congestion, anywhere there's distribution grid upgrades needed, there will be a battery. Because you can put a battery in place of those upgrades, and that battery provides many more assets to the grid. And now when you're talking about V to G or V to X, those batteries in these cars are extraordinarily sophisticated. They're much more energy dense than the stuff that we build because you're driving around a battery. Our batteries just sit in the field somewhere. If the utilities can get the intelligence around how to deploy those batteries wisely, and if owners of the vehicle can get comfortable with the fact that that car may, instead of being at 80% state of charge, may be at 50% state of charge when they want it, then this is going to go a long way. Now, that second part, the owners getting comfortable, I think is going to be the biggest challenge. And we have to be really thoughtful about how we do that. And it's probably point of sale. So when you buy a car, yeah. It's a great master's topic. Go back, revisit, turn it into a PhD. So the center just stepped up. We got the center now in the game. Yeah, so that's a great point. And at the point of sale, when a consumer's actually buying the vehicle, is the best opportunity, I think, to explain all of that. Hey, you can sign up for this program with PGE where the cost of your charging is going to be X minus because you're participating in this program. And when we actually use it, we're going to pay you something. Like the opportunity to do that isn't 6 months after you buy it. It's when you're buying it, when you're really thinking about it. And it's it's really an educational need that is going to have to be between the seller of the vehicle and the buyer. And, that's going to be facilitated by the utility. But boy, yes. And they should be. So a passive participant, because the OEM isn't going to be actively scheduling the asset. It's going to be a passive asset on the grid that the utility can then go to and consume as needed. You're shaking your head. Let's see. Yeah, everyone does have ideas. Yeah, so all of these are really great points as to why utility scale dedicated battery energy storage is still a really valuable asset on the grid. And so let's talk about why it's going to continue to be a valuable asset on the grid. And that's because of two big words, institutionalization and industrialization. In order to build these things, I think I have a picture of them. Oh, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but here's what a big facility looks like. This is a coal plant in Australia in 2012. This is what it looks like now. These dates are wrong. This should be August of 23. This is what it looks like now. So 2012, today, this is what it's going to look like in 2 years. Batteries. So this is coal, not coal, batteries. This keeps Sydney bright. If this system doesn't operate, Sydney will go dark. Now, how do you do that? How do you go from coal plant, which is an infrastructure asset financed by probably the biggest banks in Australia when it was built, to a field with no generation, to $1 billion plus project? Well, institutionalization and industrialization. Institutionalization, because you have to get everybody on the same page. You need to have standardization of a product. You need to have capital available. You need to have banks, lenders, contracts, regulators, utilities, permitting agencies, certification agencies, local fire departments. Everybody has to understand what is being built. Everybody has to understand how to finance this thing. That doesn't just happen. That takes a tremendous amount of effort. That is called institutionalization. Once you institutionalize an asset class, you can go out to the biggest pools of capital and make massive projects happen. In this case, it was the biggest pool of capital that made this project happen. BlackRock is financing this plant. The second word, industrialization. You can't build that without a global supply chain, and that takes time. Lithium ion has over decades developed a global supply chain, and over the last 5-10 years, lithium ion based energy storage has advanced that global supply chain to the scale where we can build systems that take millions upon millions of components. And we haven't done that in a vacuum. We've done that again because everybody has a cell phone in their pocket and because e-mobility is coming at an incredibly fast rate. It's not energy storage that's driving the technology, it's everything else. And that creates a virtuous cycle of investment that's focused on reducing cost, improving quality, improving efficiency. And we're just leveraging all of that investment across the world. We're leveraging the logistics and all of the supply chains that go along to make these things happen. Quality control. Powin as a company couldn't enforce quality control across the entire depth of the supply chain that we rely on. We rely on the breadth of the supply chain to ensure that the cells, the critical raw component of our system, has gone through robust quality control. We do our own testing. We've got a lab in Tualatin where we're running cells constantly to test that they're meeting the supplier's promises, but we can't do that in a vacuum. We have to rely on the breadth of the supply chain. That's industrialization. These are power plants. Like, they have SCADA systems, they've got comms, they've got to talk to the utilities, they've got to be deployable and dispatchable. That doesn't just happen. Institutionalization and industrialization of lithium ion as a grid asset makes it very difficult to displace. And it's going to be in a pole position for energy storage for the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be investing tons of money in whatever the next great tech is. We absolutely should. But right now, the best play for utility scale storage is lithium ion. And currently, the best flavor of lithium ion is lithium iron phosphate. And improvements are needed. When you see that, you're like, well, what's going to happen in 20 years? What are you going to do with all that? I don't know. Like, we're working on it. We've got some really good ideas. But in 20 years, when these things are being decommissioned, we know that there's going to be a supply chain to manage the decommissioning. We're investing in that today. We're just starting to decommission energy storage plants that have come online, 10 years ago. When a plant was built 10 years ago, it had a lifetime of 10 years. Today, it's 20 years. Tomorrow, it's going to be 25 years. And we're recycling, repurposing every single cell that Powin has put into the marketplace, we have recycled. We see that as a critical component to manage end of life and to manage the future market. We have to make these things recyclable. Yeah.
Certainly the naysayers of lithium ion storage would say that the mining aspect of it is cost prohibitive or environmentally prohibitive. Can you talk to a little bit about that part of the supply chain and maybe debunk some of those myths?
Yeah, extraction is always nasty. Like, the question was about, the sort of the base level of supply chain and the extraction needed to make these things happen. When you look at these satellite pictures of lithium ion mines and you see all the spectrums of the rainbow in the middle of a desert, that's not a great image to put on the front page of the brochure. It's not this, right? Like, this is cool. Okay, this is a plant. This isn't a desert that's covered by evaporative ponds that are pulling out lithium brine that's, 2,000 feet below the groundwater in some arid desert somewhere in the country. There is no free lunch. And the next step is never the last step, is the way I think about it. And the step that we're taking today with lithium ion as a grid asset is so much better than the alternative, which is not taking this step. And we're getting better. I think recycling over the next 10, 20, 30 years is going to play a huge role in reducing the demand for materials. And chemistry evolution is already playing a massive role. When you talk about, what are the materials that people are actually concerned about, it's cobalt. It's a conflict mineral. It's mined in really pretty negative ways. We don't use cobalt at all. We never have. Nickel is usually a component of copper mining. Copper mining is never a clean endeavor. Titanium is a very expensive material to extract. Those aren't in our cells. So we can only get better with the future steps. And I think what we see today is hopefully with ESG programs that companies are putting into place, we're looking through the supply chain to ensure A, you're not using slave labor, B, the environmental operations of all the sub-suppliers are in line with expectations. And that's what we do. We're trying to put in place the checks to ensure that as we look through the supply chain, we're not causing harm. But there is no free lunch. It's a great question. It's a really hard question. All right, so batteries. What do they actually do other than make that thing go away, which is pretty cool? 4 main things batteries are going to do and continue to do. And these attributes are going to evolve over you can't see the words, but this first is frequency regulation, voltage support. Those are grid assets. Like those are things that just help the grid. The thing that we really care about are peak shaving and load leveling. And when I talked about that first contract we got in 2016, it's a good way to illustrate sort of where we're going in the future by looking back. In 2016, we signed a contract in California that paid us to build a plant in a warehouse in Irvine that really only needed to operate a handful of days a year. CAISO went to San Diego Gas and Electric and said, hey, you need to start eliminating your peaker plants. They're too dirty, they're too expensive, stop operating them, and you can't build anymore. And this is while we're still seeing that ramp rate of electrification. So what do? You've got enough renewables on the grid. We already talked about curtailment and negative pricing in order to meet the demand, but you don't have them at the right time. You have these demand curves where, has everybody seen this, the duck curve? You have the peak in the morning, then you've got a trough, and then you've got a peak in the evening. This line's actually 2019. The blue's 2019. Or the green is 2019. The blue here is 2023. Higher is more demand, more generation. And this is generation demand. So this is on generators. In 2019, the generation demand was higher than it is today. Can anybody guess why that is? Batteries. Who said batteries? Oh, you won. All right, good prize. This side is still kind of owning it. All right, so batteries were able to move that demand curve away from the peaks. They were able to lower the peak demand and fill the gaps. So you didn't need to build those peaker plants. You didn't need to run the peaker plants. So this facility we built in California, it was designed to run only a couple days a year, and the rest of the year we could do whatever we wanted with it. We could play the market. We could arbitrage. We could buy power when it was cheap, and we could sell it back when it was expensive. That sounds like it's hurting the market. That is great for the market. That levelizes cost. We buy it when it's cheap and we move it to when it's expensive. On those 4 days, CAISO would call us up and say, hey, you guys tomorrow are going to need to run this facility for about 4 hours. And Bob back there was the guy that would actually push the button to run the facility. 4 hours, 4 days a year, paid for the construction of an entire facility. Why? Does that seem crazy? It's not crazy because the alternative is building a diesel-fired generator in the middle of a neighborhood. Because on those 4 days of the year, when it's the hottest, everybody has to run their AC. There's these peak demand, and if you think about this as the average, the peak demand would be somewhere up here. Batteries over the last 3 to 4 years have averted all blackouts in California because they've been able to shift that peak demand from the time when you had excess generation to the time when you had excess demand. They time shifted the generation to when the demand was needed. And that's load leveling and peak shaving. And that's what we're doing from now and for the next 30 years is we're going to load level and peak shave, but at a massive scale as we bring more and more renewables into the market. So what do we need to get there? Well, we need jobs. We need people. We need so many electricians. Electricians are incredibly hard to find. We need engineers. How many transmission engineers do you guys know? We need tons of them. Oh, you do. How about distribution engineers? Yes. Okay, so those people are going to become superheroes over the next 10 years because we're going to have to build so much transmission and distribution to meet this new demand and to meet this evolving grid. Distributing generation is going to fundamentally alter how we manage a grid. These huge lines that are moving back and forth, those are going to be used to time shift demand to meet generation, renewable generation capacity. And all these distribution systems are going to have a battery on them in order to micro time shift the loads throughout those distribution grids. So we need tons of electricians. We need engineers. 5 minutes. We got this wrapped up in 5 minutes. We need project managers. We need field technicians. We need maintenance techs. We need all the people that are going to build this thing. And thank goodness for the IRA. The IRA is ensuring that these people are going to be paid really well. Prevailing wage is a big component of the IRA. And the IRA is putting money into training programs. We need apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are required on our projects in order to get a credit from the investment tax credit from the IRA. There's so much to talk about there. I'd love to talk about the IRA, but let's wrap it up now and take questions. That was a lot. Yes. Yeah, what does the market look like geographically for utility scale storage? We have projects in what, like 20 countries now? 20 countries. So US, Canada, Mexico. We're bidding a bunch of projects down in Chile. The EU is just coming up, UK, Australia, the island countries, Hawaii. Well, Hawaii is not a country, but the island countries are really, really interested in energy storage because their generation is so expensive. Japan is just starting as a market. China is the biggest market, but as a US company, we can't participate. Indonesia, Singapore, New Zealand is an up and coming potential market, island country as well as sort of advanced grid. It's global. Texas and California are the primary markets. Texas is a really interesting market. We didn't touch on that, but Texas has a unique sort of a developer risk market where there's much less regulation as one would expect because it's Texas. And the developer can build virtually any facility up to 9.9 megawatts. And if they get curtailed, they get curtailed. And if they don't get curtailed, they can make a ton of money if they're in the right location. But we have projects, Washington, New Mexico, we're all over the country. Wherever the regulatory environment is allowing it, batteries are going. And where pricing is making a market sensible, batteries are going. Pricing and market design are really, really important for deployment of batteries.
Back to this part.
Yep.
Do you foresee geopolitics having a big impact on the sector or Powin specifically? I mean, the semiconductor industry is in turmoil now over, onshoring, reshoring, and the CHIPS Act. And what, if any, impact do geopolitics have on the supply chain investments that you're talking about, access to these opportunities across the world that you referenced at the beginning of your talk? Yeah. So geopolitics and impact on energy storage that's a huge, huge question. Yes, they will. 3 years ago, we went through a massive geopolitical sort of battle with China actually withholding cells from US-based energy storage manufacturers when China put in a mandate. And so the cell manufacturers, which is, when I talk about cells and batteries, just super basic level, those are two different things. Cells are the bags or boxes of chemicals. The batteries are a bunch of cells in series with some intelligence on top that can actually do something. So we build batteries, we don't make cells. China builds the world's cells, and they withheld cells from the market, and it took months to sort out. We saw massive price spikes. The IRA is trying to incentivize at really a titanic scale investment in the US to avoid domestic geopolitical impact. There are cell manufacturers that are spinning up huge investment projects to build cells here. Now, getting raw materials is a little bit tricky because those come from the global supply chain, Australia, South America, China, but China really owns all of the offtake from those mining investments. And so we should see extraction ramp up in the US in the near term, assuming the regulatory structures allow for it. Yeah. I'm just curious if Powin is exploring other technologies.
Yeah, so exploring other technologies. I would say that flow is not a different chemistry. Flow is a different technology. And we're going to have the flow expert up here on a panel. Let's ask questions about flow there, but we are exploring different chemistries all the time. We have a full battery lab where we're testing, cycling, I don't know how many cells at a time, but yes, we're always looking at different chemistries. And right now, the best cost, best fit is lithium iron phosphate, which is an interesting cell because it came from the bus industry. Initially, our cells were destined for buses. And now energy storage, stationary energy storage has gotten to such a scale that we're getting our own specific cells just for energy storage. It's not leftover bus cells anymore. But lithium iron phosphate continues to be the safest and best cost alternative, in our opinion.
Grid being able to transfer energy. As a market, downstream market, it's not possible for us to think about smart grids or micro grids that will allow us to localize.
Yeah, so rather than transmitting energy throughout the grid, keep it local with distributed generation and microgrids. So absolutely, we're seeing distributed generation in every single neighborhood across the country with solar. And how do you move that solar around? Well, you start at the most local sort of unit, which is the home where the solar is located. And then if there's excess, you have a technology, a net metering technology to then move it into the grid. And those electrons are, I mean, like the grid moves at the speed of light, right? You don't really care where the electrons come from. Our projects don't care if they're coming from solar or wind or coal. It doesn't matter. It's what ends up in a battery is the cheapest electron at that time. And what goes out of the battery is the most expensive electron at that time. And that's that's not actually true, but that's to simplify it as much as possible. So we're agnostic. We're agnostic where those electrons come from. And the more you localize any sort of grid asset, whether it be battery or generation, theoretically, you're going to localize the consumption of that electron also. Because why would you do it in a distributed manner if you're not going to consume that distributed generation or storage in the same way? Otherwise, you build transmission. Last question. That's a great question. So we didn't talk about duration all that much. We started with 1 hour batteries, much more niche technology, moved to 2 hour. Texas still sort of has a 2 hour bent, developing markets like 2 hour batteries. And all that means is the battery can run at its max power capacity for that duration. And 4 hours right now is sort of the sweet spot. We think 4 hours has a pretty good set of legs. It's going to be 4 hours will be the standard for a period of time. You can design systems that can run for denominations of 4 hours with inverter technology. So you can still use a 4 hour battery. I don't think that lithium iron phosphate as a chemistry is probably an 8, 12, 24 hour battery. There's other technologies that are going to be better suited because you just lose too much in the chemical conversion to make it efficient. But you can design a system appropriately. Great question. Let's wrap it up. Thank you.